rain had been falling for hours, a relentless drum on the corrugated metal roofs of the abandoned alley, and yet she didn't move. She was huddled in a corner. A tiny, trembling German Shepherd puppy pressed against her chest, her wet fur plastered to her thin body, eyes wide and dark, full of a desperate kind of fear that made my chest tighten. The smell of mud and decay hung thick in the air, but she didn't flinch when I approached. She only shifted her weight protectively over the litter of smaller pups, each one whimpering, shivering, too weak to even cry out properly. I crouched closer, careful not to startle her, and that's when I noticed it, her ribs, sharp under the thin coat, her paws caked with mud, her tail tucked so tightly it was almost invisible. She was starving, but she refused to leave her babies, refusing even a single bite of the scraps I offered. The alley seemed endless, the shadows deep, yet all of the chaos, all of the cold and wet and sorrow, centered on her small, unwavering devotion. I had seen neglect, I had seen fear, but I had never seen love so fierce, so raw, so unwilling to bend even in the face of death. In that moment, something broke inside me, and I knew I had to do more than just watch. The rain had been relentless for hours, each drop hammering against the corrugated metal roofs of the abandoned alley, creating a rhythm that felt almost alive, almost accusatory. I had never been so aware of sound, the way water pooled in uneven patches on the cracked concrete, the distant rumble of thunder that made the alley seem smaller, darker, more suffocating. And there she was, a tiny German Shepherd mother, pressed into the corner of a crumbling brick wall, her fur matted, soaked through, clinging to the sharp outline of her ribs. Her eyes, wide and glossy, flicked toward me, then back to her litter, and I understood immediately that she was both a fortress and a prisoner, a creature who had chosen vigilance over surrender. Each of her pups shivered violently, the smallest almost translucent under her body, and I could see the raw tension in her shoulders, the tremble in her paws as she adjusted to shield them from the cold. The stench of wet earth, decay and hunger hung thick in the alley, and yet she moved with deliberate care, nudging a tiny pup who had slipped from her warmth, licking it with a soft, precise tongue despite the tremor of exhaustion running through her body. I offered food, scraps from a plastic bag I had brought, and her nose twitched, but she did not eat, not a bite, not until her pups had been checked, licked and repositioned. It was a refusal that was both heartbreaking and magnificent, an instinct so fierce it felt almost human, almost like a vow. She would starve before they did, and in that moment, I realized I was not a rescuer, I was an intruder, a witness to a devotion I could barely comprehend. I crouched, careful not to appear threatening, listening to the whimpers of the pups as they clung to her. Some were barely breathing, tiny bodies shivering in a rhythm almost too fragile to measure. The mother's eyes never left me, but there was no malice there, only calculation and a raw, instinctive wariness. I could feel the tension coiling through her limbs, the way her tail tucked tightly beneath her body, the way she positioned herself like a shield over her children. Every slight movement of mine, leaning forward, shifting my weight, stretching out a hand, was a negotiation, a test of trust that I could not yet pass. And yet I could not look away. Each second stretched into eternity. I felt the cold seep into my own bones, but it was nothing compared to the ache I could see in her body, the quiet suffering that she bore silently, utterly alone. The alley itself seemed to conspire against her. Broken shards of glass glinted in the puddles like dangerous promises, a discarded soda can rattled against a fence in the wind, and the rainwater turned the dirt into a sludge that made movement slow, treacherous. Yet she navigated it all without hesitation, calculating every step, every nudge of a pup, every turn of her body. It was a choreography of survival, an invisible script written by instinct and fear and love that refused to bend. Her eyes held stories I could not yet read, memories of hunger, of cold, of streets that had given nothing and taken everything, but in her gaze I also saw courage, fierce and unyielding, a force I could not ignore. I tried speaking softly, letting my voice carry no threat, and she twitched her ears, tilted her head and then returned to her pups. She would not be swayed by words, she required action, proof, a gesture that matched the weight of her devotion. I watched her adjust a pup that had shifted awkwardly against the wet concrete, licking its tiny face with a care that seemed impossible under her condition. Her paws sank slightly into the muddy water as she repositioned herself, but she did not flinch, did not complain, and yet every now and then a subtle shiver ran through her, the small involuntary signs of hunger and fatigue that she could not mask, that she could not deny. I could almost feel her heartbeat through the air between us, a rapid, anxious rhythm that seemed to echo the rain itself. Each whimper of a pup, each tremor of a tiny body, pulled her gaze immediately back to them, and I realized that she was living on borrowed strength, on adrenaline and instinct alone. To intervene without her consent would be to violate a sacred invisible code. I was learning patience the way the cold seeped into my fingers, slowly, painfully, irrevocably. The rain eased slightly, a brief lull that left a heavy, misty fog hanging over the alley, curling around every brick, every puddle, every trembling figure. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet fur and earth, and I could hear her labored breathing over the faint whispers of wind. I tried offering food again, placing a few scraps closer to her pups so she could see that no harm was intended. She sniffed, a subtle tilt of her nose, but she did not eat. She nudged her pup over the morsel, gently, deliberately, a mother's calculus that placed the children before herself. My throat tightened. I had never understood love so raw, so unyielding, so total. In that moment, the rain, the alley, the cold, the hunger, it all became a stage for something sacred, a testament to resilience and sacrifice that I could only observe, silent and inadequate. Time blurred. Minutes became an hour, or maybe it was only seconds, but each movement felt monumental. She shifted her pups one by one, adjusting them to her warmth, repositioning herself to shield them from a chill wind that swept down the alley. Her eyes met mine once, a brief flicker, and in that glance, I felt her weighing me, deciding whether I belonged here, whether I could be trusted. I imagined the lives she had lived before this alley, the hunger, the cold, the nights when warmth and safety were luxuries she could not claim. Yet here she was, unbroken in her devotion, carrying all her pain and exhaustion, choosing the tiny lives of her pups over her own survival. I wanted to move closer, to help, but I had learned already that the wrong movement could undo everything. So I waited, silent, cold, aching, bearing witness to a courage I had never imagined. And then something shifted. A pup whimpered, too weak to crawl, and the mother nudged it gently with her nose, repositioning it under her warmth. Her eyes softened for just a moment, not toward me, but into the small space between life and death that she was holding open for her children. It was a moment of quiet grace, a fleeting sign that even in the harshest conditions, even in the face of relentless rain, maternal love could carve a space for hope. I felt tears sting my eyes, unbidden, as I watched her tiny body shiver, as I listened to the delicate trembling breaths of the pups she had chosen to protect above all else. The alley around us could collapse, the rain could pour harder, the world could be cruel beyond imagining, but here, in this corner, in this frozen, wet, trembling tableau, love had found its fiercest expression. I stayed until the light dimmed, until shadows grew long and the alley seemed to close in around her. I could not take her yet, not without earning her trust, but I could not leave either. I sat at a careful distance, shivering alongside her, feeling the enormity of her sacrifice, the depth of her instinct, and the absolute unyielding devotion that refused even the smallest relief for herself. And in that quiet, rainy evening, I understood something I had never known before, that courage is often silent, invisible to the world, and that love can burn brighter than fear, fiercer than hunger, and stronger than despair. She was a tiny, trembling German Shepherd mother, standing at the edge of survival, and yet she was infinite in her heart, unstoppable in her devotion, a force I could only witness and hope to honor. The morning after the storm broke, the alley smelled of damp concrete and something more primal, fear, hunger, and survival pressed into every corner. The mist hung low, curling in spirals around the mother German Shepherd as she shifted protectively over her litter. I approached slowly, each step calculated, feeling the weight of my own heartbeat echo in the silent tension between us. She raised her ears, nostrils flaring, a low, cautious growl vibrating in her throat, but she did not run. Her eyes, dark, wary, luminous with both suspicion and exhaustion, held mine, reading every motion, every breath. I lowered myself to the wet ground, hands trembling slightly, and placed a small bowl of water at a careful distance. It was a simple gesture, almost ridiculous in its hopefulness, but her eyes softened fractionally as she sniffed the air. Then she shifted, pressing herself closer to the tiny pups as if to say, "I am not convinced yet." I understood. I had to earn her trust, step by delicate step, with patience that stretched my own nerves thin. The first hour passed in silence. I did not move, I did not speak, only watched as she adjusted a pup whose weak body trembled uncontrollably. Each whimper, each tiny gasp, made me ache in ways I had not anticipated. Her devotion was magnetic, pulling me into her fragile world. I whispered words she could not hear, apologies and reassurances for the lives she had endured, and yet she tolerated my presence only grudgingly. Slowly, deliberately, I extended a hand, palm up, letting her scent guide her. She sniffed carefully, ears twitching, body tense as a coiled spring, then stepped back. I held my breath, heart hammering. The first sign of movement, the faintest softening of her stance, was enough to make the hours I had spent in the rain feel like minutes. Food became the bridge between fear and curiosity. I had brought scraps, warmed slightly to make them more enticing, and placed them a careful arm's length away from her pups. Her nose twitched, eyes darting between the food and the trembling lives beneath her chest. She had not eaten for hours, maybe longer, and yet she ignored it, nudging a pup gently toward the morsel before lowering her head to inspect. That tiny motion, a careful calculation of survival and sacrifice, felt like a miracle. I could see the hunger etched into her bones, ribs sharp under the wet coat, paws caked with mud, and yet she measured each movement by the safety and nourishment of her pups. I whispered her name softly, unsure if she could hear it, but perhaps she sensed the tenderness behind the sound. A single whimper from a pup brought her gaze back in an instant, and her eyes glimmered with vigilance, a fortress no hand could breach without consent. The morning light filtered through the low clouds, slanting across the alley, illuminating the rain-soaked bricks and puddles. It highlighted the mother's wet fur, streaked with mud, and the tiny bodies of her litter barely moving, barely breathing. Each breath she drew was a calculation, a pause, a testament to instinct and love that refused compromise. I inched closer, careful to remain at her level, offering water again and speaking softly, allowing her to dictate the pace. She watched me, calculating, measuring my intentions. A subtle wag of the tail, almost imperceptible, was her first acknowledgement of possibility. Trust, I realized, was not given. It was earned in the smallest gestures, in the patient bending of the will, in the silent understanding that I would not harm what she loved most. Hours passed. The alley transformed into a stage of quiet negotiation, each movement deliberate, each glance weighted with meaning. She nudged a pup gently with her nose, repositioning it beneath her warmth, and in that motion I saw an unspoken promise: I will protect them whatever it costs. I mirrored her patience, inching closer, offering food in small increments, never forcing, never rushing. A soft rain continued to mist around us, turning the concrete slick and slippery, the air heavy with damp and the metallic tang of lingering storm. The pups, sensing my calm but not fully trusting, began to shift against their mother's body, tiny limbs curling into her warmth. She responded with subtle movements, adjusting them, licking them, her body a living shield. I could feel the tension in my own muscles ease slightly, a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. By midday, the first breakthrough came. One of the smaller pups, a trembling shadow of vulnerability, crawled toward the scraps I had left. The mother's ears twitched. She lifted her head, watching intently, then nudged the pup gently with her nose. The pup froze, then hesitated, and finally touched the food. The mother's eyes never left us, yet she allowed the tiny act of autonomy, a signal that perhaps survival need not always be solely on her terms. My chest tightened. I whispered reassurances, careful to match the pace of her trust, careful not to rush what had taken hours to build. Each bite the pup took, each hesitant movement toward nourishment, was a victory not just of sustenance, but of connection, a fragile bridge between instinctive fear and cautious hope. As the afternoon light grew softer, the first moments of physical contact became possible, a tentative hand on the mother's shoulder, a brief stroke along her wet fur, and she flinched but did not flee. Her eyes, still wary, held something new, consideration, the faintest flicker of acknowledgement. The litter pressed closer to her, tiny bodies seeking warmth, while she allowed the intrusion, monitoring my actions with precise attention. Every motion mattered, the tilt of her head, the rise and fall of her chest, the small flick of a paw. I had become a part of this fragile ecosystem, a participant in the silent negotiations of trust and survival, and in that participation, I felt my own heart expand, breaking and mending in equal measure at the intensity of her devotion. Evening fell, and the mist from the morning storm lingered, curling around our small space. I remained crouched, offering water and small morsels, speaking softly, letting her dictate the tempo of engagement. She had begun to eat slightly, not for herself, but beside her pups, a small concession to survival that did not diminish her devotion. I watched as she curled her body around them, ears alert, eyes luminous in the dim light, her posture protective, maternal, fierce. The alley, with all its decay, rain and shadows, became a sanctuary not by nature, but by the force of love and persistence that radiated from her small, trembling body. In her presence I understood the enormity of patience, the quiet power of maternal instinct, and the delicate art of earning trust when fear has been the only constant companion. By the time darkness settled fully, the mother had allowed the briefest, gentlest touch, a hand resting on her neck as she nudged a pup into place. It was a gesture small in action, monumental in meaning. She had not surrendered, but she had begun to accept. In that tiny concession the bridge had been built. The first fragile step toward rescue had been taken, not through force, not through coercion, but through patience, empathy, and reverence for the love she held for her pups. As I rose slowly, careful not to startle her, I realized that I had witnessed something profound, a living example of selfless devotion, courage that refused compromise, and a trust that once earned could transform fear into hope. The alley remained damp, the air thick with mist, and yet the tension had shifted. There was a beginning now, a fragile thread connecting her to the possibility of survival beyond this corner. I would return, I would continue, but tonight I would carry with me the weight and beauty of a heart that refused to yield, a devotion that had already taught me more than I could have imagined. The alley had taken on a different character by the next morning. The fog lingered low, curling like ghostly fingers around the edges of trash cans and puddles, turning familiar shapes into looming threats. The mother German shepherd moved cautiously, pups pressed tightly beneath her, eyes darting at every shadow, every unexpected sound. I approached slowly, mindful that trust could vanish in a single misstep, a single gesture too abrupt. Her gaze met mine immediately, sharp and calculating, but there was no growl this time, only tension, wary curiosity. I could feel my own pulse in my throat as I surveyed the alley, shards of glass glinting in the dim light, a broken bottle wedged against a fence, the smell of rotting food mixed with the metallic tang of rain-soaked concrete. Every step she took was deliberate, protective, a choreography I could not rush. Today, if trust had any weight at all, it would be measured in the fragile balance of hope and fear. The pups were small, some barely more than shadows beneath her wet fur, bodies shivering in unison with the cold morning air. I offered food again, placing it slightly closer than the day before, speaking softly, letting my presence settle like a whisper in the fog. Her eyes flicked to the morsels, then back to me, then down at her trembling litter. She sniffed cautiously, a nose twitch, and I held my breath, feeling the tension coil around my chest. The first act of submission, or maybe consideration, was a subtle shift of her weight, a barely perceptible nod toward the food. It was a silent message: I am watching, I am deciding, but I have not yet surrendered. I waited, each second stretching, each breath measured, until finally one of the pups crept forward, tiny paws slipping on slick concrete, nose touching the scraps. She watched with a taut, invisible leash of attention, nudging the pup gently, then allowing it to feed. My chest tightened as I realized the bridge had strengthened slightly, but the journey was far from over. I needed to move closer, to guide her into safety, but every instinct in me screamed caution. One wrong move, one abrupt reach, could shatter all the fragile trust painstakingly built. The alley, which had once felt merely hostile, now felt alive, aware, a living labyrinth of threat and protection. A stray cat darted across the far corner, sending a flurry of frightened birds into the gray sky, and the mother's ears flattened, her body taut, pups pressing harder against her. I froze, letting the moment pass, letting her recalibrate, letting her teach me the rhythm of her vigilance. This was no longer about feeding or observation, it was about negotiation, a dialogue of body language and instinct that could decide life or death for the fragile lives beneath her. Every step forward was measured, deliberate, a careful dance with the unseen hazards that could undo everything in an instant. The first attempt to move them required patience I didn't know I possessed. I placed my hand flat on the ground, palm down, letting the mother approach on her own terms. She sniffed, ears flicking, tail tense, eyes locked on me as though weighing my intentions against the gravity of her duty. One pup shifted under her, a soft whimper escaping its trembling lips, and she responded instantly, repositioning it, her body curling around them like molten iron, solid and protective. I spoke in the softest tones, encouraging, non-threatening, letting her lead the interaction. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, I extended a hand toward the edge of the litter, not touching, not reaching, simply offering the presence of help. Her gaze pierced me, sharp and demanding, and for a heartbeat, I felt the weight of all her past suffering, all the hunger, all the nights of fear compressed into a single unwavering stare. And then she moved, a tiny step closer, a subtle concession that marked the first crack in the fortress she had built around herself. We began the slow migration toward safety, one deliberate step at a time. I guided her gently, letting her lead the way, keeping the pups shielded beneath her. Each puddle became a potential hazard, each scrap of broken glass a threat, and yet she navigated with a precision born of instinct and necessity. My own body ached from crouching, from tensing at every movement, but I could not stop. Not now, not when so much hung in the balance. The alley seemed endless, twisting, oppressive, yet every careful step brought us closer to something resembling hope. I whispered encouragement, soft and rhythmic, trying to match the cadence of her cautious movements. The pups clung to her warmth, tiny bodies trembling but gradually gaining strength as we advanced. I could feel the bond between us solidifying, fragile as it was, built on patience, respect, and the recognition of shared purpose. The most perilous moment came near the old fence at the end of the alley. A sudden clatter of metal, probably the wind, probably a distant delivery truck, sent her into full alert. She barked sharply, her body coiled, pups tumbling beneath her protective weight. My heart lurched. I froze, holding my breath as she scanned the shadows. Her growl was low, cautious, a warning to the world and perhaps to me. Do not cross the line. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply let her assess, let her understand that I was not a threat. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Then gradually, the tension softened. She sniffed my hand briefly, and in that fleeting touch I felt the culmination of all our silent negotiations. Trust was no longer abstract. It had taken physical form, a bond forged in patience, fear, and devotion. Finally, we reached the threshold of a safer space, a small, sheltered courtyard, where the air was cleaner, the concrete dry in patches, and there were fewer immediate hazards. She paused, eyes scanning, body tense, pups pressed close. I waited, letting her claim the territory first, letting her judge the new environment. Then carefully, I offered food again, placing it just beyond the litter's reach. She sniffed, watched, then allowed a pup to approach. The smallest pup, trembling violently, inched forward, and the mother's nose guided it, protective and gentle. I could see her muscles relax minutely, the tension in her shoulders easing, just enough to suggest a willingness to cooperate, to consider survival beyond the alley. It was a fragile victory, a first step toward rescue, but monumental nonetheless. As twilight descended, painting the courtyard in soft purple and gray, I finally allowed myself to exhale. She had not surrendered fully. She remained vigilant, wary, a fortress around her children, but she had begun to trust me. The pups, tiny and fragile, were no longer trembling as violently, their breathing steadier, their eyes brighter in the muted light. I sat at a careful distance, feeling the magnitude of what had just occurred. This was not just a rescue in motion, it was a negotiation with instinct, a dialogue of devotion, a testament to patience, empathy, and the unyielding power of love. And as the first stars blinked faintly above the fog-shrouded courtyard, I knew the hardest part was still ahead, earning her full trust, guiding her to safety, and proving that the world outside the alley could care for her as fiercely as she cared for her pups. The small courtyard had become a sanctuary, a fragile world carved out from the chaos of the alley. The mother German shepherd had begun to relax, just slightly, her movements less tense, her eyes softening as she allowed the pups to crawl over her, nibble at the food I provided, and explore the patch of earth that was safe for the first time in their lives. The first tentative bites she took for herself were small, almost ritualistic, always beside her litter, always measured, as though even nourishment had to pass through the filter of her devotion. The sunlight broke through the clouds in pale streaks, landing on the wet fur of the pups and the gleaming dark coat of their mother, illuminating the dirt, the scars, the small victories of survival. It was in these quiet moments, watching her shift her weight to shelter a trembling pup, that I realized growth was never linear. It was fragile, slow, measured in breaths and nudges and soft nudges of trust. The pups, once shivering shadows beneath her body, began to stretch their tiny limbs, wobble on unsure paws, and emit the faint, joyous yips of discovery. She watched them intently, ears flicking at every sound, tail curling protectively around them, but her body was no longer taut with constant fear. In the small moments between vigilance and exhaustion, I saw something extraordinary, a mother teaching her children not just to survive but to trust, to feel safe, to claim small pieces of the world as their own. I joined in carefully, offering gentle touches, speaking softly, letting her scent me in proximity without intrusion. Each hesitant sniff, each tiny lick of reassurance, was a thread weaving a bond between us, delicate yet unbreakable. Evening brought cooler air, and with it the first sign of real play. A pup tumbled over a puddle, slipping slightly, and the mother barked softly, correcting and encouraging, tail wagging briefly, muscles easing. I watched the interplay with tears pressing at my eyes, the raw beauty of instinct meeting recovery, of fear giving way to cautious joy. I could feel my own heart stretching in response, learning patience, humility, and the staggering weight of maternal devotion. In her I saw the definition of courage, a love that persisted through hunger, cold fear and neglect. In the pups I saw hope, fragile, awkward, yet resilient, shaping the world around them with the first spark of trust. That night as the courtyard cooled and stars appeared above, she curled around her pups, noses pressed into fur, bodies tangled in warmth. I stayed nearby, careful to give her space, careful to honor the invisible boundary she had set. And as I watched her, I understood that growth was quiet, almost imperceptible. It was measured in breaths that were no longer frantic, in paws that dared to stretch beyond shelter, in trust given slowly, and in the unspoken bond between beings who had shared fear, survival and love. The alley was behind us now, a memory etched in mud and rain, but the lessons lingered: resilience, patience, and the profound truth that love, fierce, unwavering, and selfless, could carve life from even the most broken places. Sunlight poured into the small sanctuary like a benediction, spilling over the mother German shepherd and her litter as they tumbled across the dry earth, pups yipping and tumbling, tails wagging with clumsy enthusiasm. The mother's eyes, once wide with fear, now shone with quiet pride, muscles relaxed, posture strong. She moved with confidence, nudging a pup into line, correcting another with a soft nudge, and then allowing herself a small stretch, a rare moment of indulgence. The courtyard had transformed into a place of life and warmth, a world of recovery and trust, and I could see it reflected in every cautious glance, every flick of a tail, every trembling whimper now softened into playful sound. The bond between human and mother had strengthened to an unspoken understanding, and in that connection, survival had blossomed into something richer: hope, love, and the knowledge that life could be tender even after the harshest storms. I watched them with a mixture of awe and relief. The mother allowed herself moments of play, chasing after a pup who darted too far, tail wagging, eyes bright with joy. Her body was no longer a fortress of fear, but a vessel of protection and teaching, of care and affection. The pups explored the edges of the courtyard, noses twitching, tiny claws scraping against the earth, discovering the textures, smells, and possibilities of the world beyond the alley. Each stumble, each hesitant sniff, was a lesson taught by instinct and nurtured by trust. And every interaction between the mother and her litter was mirrored subtly in my own movements, a silent dialogue of respect and connection. I had learned patience, empathy, and the quiet weight of devotion through watching her, and now those lessons felt indelible, engraved in my heart like the curve of a paw print pressed into damp earth. By afternoon the mother approached me freely, brushing against my hand, letting me stroke her wet fur without flinching. It was a gesture that spoke of trust earned, patience recognized, and the small, beautiful miracle of connection formed in the shadows of despair. The pups gathered around, sniffing, pawing, accepting the presence of another being in their world. I could feel my own chest expand with emotion, gratitude, relief, and a quiet joy I had not anticipated. They were alive, thriving, free to grow beyond the darkness they had known. The alley, the rain, the cold nights, they were behind them now, memories etched but no longer chains. As evening descended, painting the courtyard in golden hues, I sat at a distance, watching the mother curl protectively around her pups once more. She was fierce, proud, and utterly devoted, yet there was softness now, a quiet satisfaction in her eyes, a recognition that survival had turned into life, that fear had transformed into trust. One of the pups yipped playfully, tumbling over another, and she barked softly, not with alarm, but with encouragement, a final note of love and guidance. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the journey, the depth of her resilience, and the profound truth I had witnessed, that love, fierce and unwavering, could save and transform. In the quiet twilight I realized that our story had come full circle. From fear to survival, from hunger to hope, from despair to connection, she had taught me what courage and devotion truly meant. And as stars blinked above, I saw them, mother and litter, proud and free, and I knew finally that even in the darkest alleys, love could carve out a world of light. Earth,